You know, some people say that the solution to reducing the violence in Mexico and Central America, the drug-related, prohibition-related violence, is simply for the American consumer to stop consuming the drugs that are marketed from these countries. And there's no question that if American consumption were suddenly cut off, that would in fact reduce the profits for the gangsters as well as the violence south of the border. But I think that's really a futile answer to this problem for a number of reasons. First, people have been saying that for decades, blaming the consumers, in the same way that people blamed the American consumer of alcohol during alcohol prohibition. But ultimately, that argument has not worked, it is not working. Secondly, the number of Americans who actually consume these drugs, the numbers consuming cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine is probably not much more than 1, 2, at best 3% of the US population. Many of them coming from the poorest part of our population. The notion that they would be influenced by, oh my God, the violence you're generating down in Latin America, I think is fairly far-fetched. The third thing, when I go down to Latin America and I hear Latin Americans say, why doesn't the United States crack down on its consumers? After all, we're suffering the consequences of this war on drugs down here. I understand their frustration, but what people don't understand in Latin America is how hard the governments are cracking down in the United States and how many people are suffering. We have 500,000 people behind bars on a drug charge in America. That's almost as many as people as all of Latin America incarcerates for everything. We have 800,000 people being arrested each year for marijuana possession. We have tens of millions of people being drug tested without cause. We have human rights and civil liberties being violated routinely. So the notion that the United States, which has the harshest internal drug policy to some extent in the world, should crack down more is exactly the wrong thing. If you want to look at where the solution really lies, it's in reforming and ultimately ending the drug prohibitionist regime. You know, alcohol and tobacco are major drug problems, but there's virtually no violence in those markets. And the fact of the matter, if we were to legalize marijuana, the violence in that market would essentially evaporate, and the gangsters would essentially be pushed out of it because their competitive advantage in the markets is their effectiveness at the use of violence and intimidation. You know, people thought the gangsters would dominate alcohol after alcohol prohibition was repealed, but they were basically out of the business within a few years or a few decades. The other alternative, and the one that sort of lies in the middle between the legalization model, like we have with alcohol or cigarettes, or on the other hand, the blame the consumer model, which sometimes hears from both US leaders and Latin American leaders, is to say that with that population of drug users, the ones who are determined to get the drugs, whether or not they're legal or illegal, allow them to get it from legal, regulated, licensed sources. It's more or less what the Europeans are doing with seriously addicted heroin addicts, allowing them to come to clinics and to get their heroin there. So this stops short of saying sell these drugs like alcohol or tobacco. In other words, legalize it in that broad way. But it does say allow a legal source for those drugs to those people who are most committed to getting it. And when you consider that with many drugs, both legal or illegal, it's a small percentage of the consumers, 10 or 20%, who actually consume 60, 70, or 80% of the drugs, the really heavy users, that if you could remove a significant portion of them from the market, not by putting them in jail, but instead by allowing them to get legal access to these drugs, that would go a long ways towards drying up the black markets, disempowering the gangsters, and reducing drug-related, or I should say prohibition-related violence in Latin America and other parts of the world.